Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, a monumental work that's shaped so much political thinking over centuries. But it's also one that gets misunderstood a lot, even, trashed sometimes. We're going to pull back the curtain.
Yeah, we are. We're diving into Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince. It's been causing debate for, over 500 years now?
Easily.
And we'll bring in some biography, some analysis, too, to really get the context. Our mission, really, is to get straight to the source, see what Machiavelli actually said about power, about leadership, human nature, try to cut through those misconceptions.
That's right. So the goal for you listening is to walk away with a much clearer picture of what Machiavellian actually means. It's more than just that negative label it's become.
It's more.
We want to find those surprising bits, the useful insights from these old texts. Help you get informed fast.
Okay.
So let's start with Machiavelli's world. Because you can't really get The Prince without understanding Florence in the late 1400s, early 1500s. It was, turbulent is putting it mildly.
Oh, absolutely. Constant shifts in power. Italy was just a patchwork of warring city-states.
Yeah, and you had these big foreign players messing around, France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, popes, leading armies, cities getting sacked, like Rome in 1527. It was chaotic.
It really was, and that chaos directly shaped his thinking and his life. Remember, Florence became a republic for a while, and Machiavelli served it as a diplomat.
Right, he was involved.
Deeply involved. But then, 1512, the Medici family comes back to power.
And Machiavelli's out.
Out, accused of conspiracy, thrown in prison, even tortured.
Wow.
Yeah. When he got out, he was exiled to his country estate. And that's when he started writing. He wrote this famous letter about how he'd spend his days, managing the farm, getting muddy. But in the evening, he said he'd put on his courtly robes, go into a study, and basically converse with the great minds of antiquity, read history, think about politics.
So the prince came out of that.
Exactly. He called it a little gift, based on, he said, long experience in contemporary affairs and a continual study of antiquity. And he explicitly wrote it, hoping to get back in the good graces of the Medici. It was practical.
Okay, so that leads to this whole debate, doesn't it? The two Machiavellis. Because the prince seems to favor a monarch, a prince.
Right.
But then his other big work, Discourses on Livy, is all about republics. So which is it?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. He actually provides the key himself. He said, look, any successful state, whether it's run by a prince or nobles or the people, needs two things. Force combined with prudence.
Force and prudence.
Yeah. Prudence, like wisdom or good judgment, isn't enough on its own. And force without prudence just destroys things. You need both, always. For him, that was the constant, no matter the type of government. It's about stability, ultimately.
That makes sense. It cuts through the apparent contradiction.
It does. And it really set him apart from, say, someone like Erasmus. Erasmus wrote Education of a Christian Prince around the same time.
Right, more idealistic.
Yeah, very idealistic. Telling the prince to be loved, be just, be benevolent. Machiavelli looked at the world, looked at history, and said, well, that's nice, but is it effective? Especially on that question of being loved versus feared. That's a core thing we need to unpack.
Okay, let's do that. Let's dive into his actual advice. Where does he start with building a state?
Foundations. He says you need good laws and good arms. And interestingly, he connects them directly. He basically says you can't have good laws without good arms. And if you have good arms, good laws will likely follow.
So the military comes first?
In a way, yes. For a prince, he's blunt. The only thing you really need to study is war and its rules and discipline.
That's it.
That's the main job. He says train constantly, physically hunt, get to know your own territory inside out, mountains, valleys, rivers, know it like the back of your hand. That's vital for defense and for projecting power.
And mentally.
Read history, study the great military leaders, Alexander, Caesar, people like that. Imitate what worked, avoid their mistakes, learn from the past.
Okay, so good arms. What kind of arms? This is where he gets really specific, isn't he? About mercenaries.
Oh, absolutely. This is fascinating. He has this incredibly strong condemnation of mercenary and auxiliary troops. Auxiliaries being troops borrowed from another ruler.
Right.
He calls them useless and dangerous. Full stop.
Why so harsh?
Because, he argues, they're fundamentally unreliable. They're disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful. They might look brave when they're with friends, but they're cowards against a real enemy. Their only motivation, money. And as he points out, money isn't enough to make someone willing to die for you.
Makes sense.
He blames Italy's problems, its weakness, squarely on its reliance on these hired soldiers for centuries.
Right.
He talks about King Charles VIII of France just walking into Italy with chalk in hand, basically marking where his troops would stay unopposed.
Wow. He just strolled in.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Because the Italian states had no real defense of their own. So the contrast is stark. Machiavelli insists a prince must rely on his own forces. His subjects, his citizens, people directly dependent on him. He gives examples. Cesare Borgia, who ditched his French auxiliaries for his own men. Hero of Syracuse, who actually wiped out his mercenaries and built his own army.
Even biblical examples, right, David?
Yeah, David refusing Saul's armor because it wasn't his own. And he points to Rome started to decline, he says, when it began hiring Goths, outsourcing its fighting strength. The lesson is crystal clear. Rely on yourself, your own people.
Okay, so you've got your own army. Now, what about running the state? He talks about different kinds of states, right?
Yeah.
Hereditary versus new ones.
Yes, hereditary states, ones you inherit, are generally easier. Just don't rock the boat too much, don't mess with old customs, and people will usually accept you.
Seems straightforward.
But new principalities, or mixed ones where you've annexed new territory, that's where the real difficulties lie. People might welcome a change initially, hoping things will get better, but then they often find the new ruler is actually worse. Maybe he burdens them with soldiers, taxes, disrupts their lives, so resentment builds quickly.
So how do you handle that if you've just taken over a new place?
He offers specific strategies. If the new territory is culturally similar, same language, same customs, it's easier. He says, first, eliminate the old ruling family completely.
Oof, harsh.
Yeah. But necessary, in his view. Then, crucially, don't change their laws or taxes too much. Let them feel things are mostly the same, and they'll integrate more easily.
Okay, but what if it's a totally different place? Different language, laws, customs.
That's much harder. He suggests two main options. The best, he thinks, is for the prince to actually go and live there himself.
Move in.
Yeah, like the Ottoman Sultan did in Constantinople, or Greece, as Machiavelli refers to it. If you're there, you can spot trouble early, react quickly, people see your authority directly, and it prevents officials from ripping people off. It makes your hold much stronger.
And the second option?
Send colonies.
Whoa.
Send some of your own people to settle in key locations. This is way cheaper than maintaining a big garrison of soldiers.
Right.
And it only really hurts the few people whose land you take. And they're usually scattered and poor, so they can't fight back effectively. Everyone else is left alone, and they're usually too scared to cause trouble anyway.
Compared to soldiers.
Exactly. Soldiers stationed everywhere cost a fortune and annoy everyone. They alienate the population. Colonies are smarter, more loyal, less costly.
And this leads to that really chilling line, doesn't it? About how you should treat people.
Ah, yes. Men ought either to be well treated or crushed.
Crushed.
Because, he says, they can get revenge for small injuries, but if you inflict a massive injury, they can't. So if you have to injure someone, make it so severe they can't possibly retaliate. It's pure pragmatism, however brutal it sounds.
It is brutal. So applying this outwards, what about dealing with neighboring states, other powers?
More strategic advice there. He says a prince should become the leader and protector of weaker neighbors, use them as allies.
Okay.
At the same time, actively work to weaken any neighbors who are already strong. Don't let them get stronger.
Keep them down.
And crucially, prevent any foreign power, one as strong as you are, from gaining influence or a foothold in your region.
Like a sphere of influence idea.
Very much so. He uses the Romans in Greece as a positive example. They made alliances with weaker states, kept Macedonia down, kicked out Antiochus, and never let their supposed allies get too powerful. Smart management.
And the negative example.
King Louis XII of France in Italy. Machiavelli lists his mistakes. He destroyed the smaller Italian powers, which removed potential allies. He made the Pope, already powerful, even stronger. He brought Spain into Italy, a major foreign rival. He didn't go live there himself, and he didn't send colonies.
A catalog of errors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the result, Louis lost everything. Machiavelli draws a general rule from this. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined. Helping your rivals, that's shooting yourself in the foot.
That seems pretty timeless advice.
It really does. Now, related to managing new territories, there's a particularly tricky problem of states that were used to being free, living under their own laws, republics.
Right. What do you do with them?
He gives three options. First, and safest in his view, destroy them completely. ruin them.
Wow.
He points to Rome destroying Carthage and other cities. He contrasts it with Sparta trying to set up friendly oligarchies, small ruling groups in places like Athens. Those failed because the desire for freedom was too strong.
So destruction is safest. What else?
Second option, go live there yourself, as we discussed. Direct control. Third option, let them keep their laws, but install an oligarchy that's loyal to you and pays tribute.
And a puppet government.
Essentially. But he warns that republics are dangerous. They have more vitality, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance because they remember their lost liberty. So ruling them indirectly is risky. Destruction or direct occupation is safer.
Okay, this is all quite stark. When you look at these historical examples, these rules, how do you see them playing out today in modern geopolitics?
Well, the language is different, obviously, but the underlying dynamics, they feel familiar, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, managing spheres of influence, worrying about rival powers getting too strong, dealing with populations in occupied territories.
Exactly. The principles of self-interest, the need for security, the strategic use of alliances or weakening rivals, the challenges of governing people who don't want you there. These haven't really changed. Machiavelli was just brutally honest about them.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to what might be the most controversial part. The prince's personal character, his qualities.
Right. This is where he really breaks from the idealistic writers like Erasmus. He says flat out, a prince has to know how to do wrong sometimes.
Has to.
When necessity requires it. He argues that trying to be perfectly good all the time will actually ruin you because the world is full of people who aren't good. He even says some supposed virtues will lead to your downfall, while some supposed vices might actually bring you security and prosperity. It's about results, not just intentions.
Okay, let's get specific. What about generosity? Being liberal versus being, well, stingy or mean?
He argues against being overly generous, what he calls liberality. It sounds good, right? Being generous.
Right.
But he says, if you're truly liberal in a grand way, you'll quickly spend all your money. Then, to keep being generous or just to function, you'll have to tax your people heavily.
Which makes them hate you.
Exactly. Or you become poor and despised. So he concludes it's actually wiser to have a reputation for meanness, which brings reproach without hatred.
Better to be seen as stingy than hated.
Yes. Because if you're thrifty, you can afford to defend yourself, you can undertake projects without crushing your people with taxes. He points to Pope Julius II, King Ferdinand of Spain, successful leaders who were known for being careful with money, not lavish spenders. Generosity, in practice, can be a weakness.
Okay, now for the big one. Cruelty versus clemency. Loved versus feared.
Yes. The classic question. Whether it be better to be loved than feared or feared than loved.
And his answer.
Ideally both. But since that's really hard to achieve...
It's much safer to be feared than loved.
Precisely. His reasoning is pretty cynical about human nature. Men, he says, are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous.
Doesn't paint a great picture.
Not at all. He argues that love is held together by obligation, a chain that men, being self-interested, will break whenever it suits them.
Okay.
But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails. People are less likely to wrong someone they fear than someone they merely love.
But there's a crucial limit here, isn't there? He adds something really important.
Absolutely critical. You should be feared, yes, but never hated. Avoid hatred at all costs.
How do you do that if you're being feared, potentially being cruel?
The key rule: keep your hands off your subjects' property and their women.
Property and women.
Those are the things that really generate hatred. He says you can execute people if you have a clear reason and justification, but don't just seize their stuff.
And he has that amazing line about...
Yes. Men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony.
Wow. That's quite a statement about human priorities.
It is. It underlines his point. Property is sacred. Don't mess with it if you want to avoid deep-seated hatred. He uses Hannibal as an example. His inhuman cruelty actually worked to keep his diverse army united through fear. Contrast that with Scipio, the Roman general, whose excessive leniency led to mutiny. Fear can be a tool, but hatred is poison.
Okay, so feared but not hated. What about honesty? Keeping your promises. Keeping faith.
Well, here again, he is brutally realistic. He observes that the most successful princes of his time weren't actually that bothered about keeping their word.
Really?
Yeah. He says they held good faith of little account and were masters of deception, of circumventing the intellect of men by craft.
So lying is okay.
He introduces that famous metaphor. The prince needs to be both a beast and a man. And the beast part has two sides, the lion and the fox.
The lion and the fox.
You need to be a lion to scare off the wolves, the threats. But you also need to be a fox to recognize the traps, the snares. You need both strength and cunning.
And the fox part relates to promises.
Exactly. He says a wise ruler cannot and should not keep his word if doing so works against his interests, or if the reasons he made the promise no longer exist.
Wow.
Because, he says bluntly, men are bad and will not keep faith with you. So you don't have to keep faith with them if it doesn't suit you. It's a pragmatic, if cynical, view of agreements.
But wait, if everyone knows you're willing to lie and break promises, won't that destroy your reputation?
Good point. And Machiavelli addresses that directly. It's all about appearance.
Appearance?
Yes. He says a prince doesn't need to have all the good qualities, mercy, faithfulness, humanity, religion, honesty, but it is absolutely necessary to appear to have them.
Fake it till you make it.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Be outwardly merciful, faithful, religious, and so on. Act the part. But crucially, be mentally prepared to switch to the complete opposite if the situation demands it.
So, be ready to be cruel, faithless, ruthless if needed.
If necessity compels you, yes. Because, he argues, most people judge by what they see, not by what they can touch or experience directly. They see your appearance. Few get close enough to know the real you.
And results matter most.
Ultimately, yes. Let a prince have the credit of conquering and holding his state. The means will always be considered honest, and he will be praised by everybody. Win, and people won't question your methods too much. He points to Pope Alexander VI, notorious for his deceptions, and Ferdinand of Spain, who talked peace and faith constantly while acting ruthlessly, and both were highly successful. Appearance is key.
This ties into internal stability too, right? Reputation protecting you from conspiracies.
Definitely. If a prince is highly esteemed, seen as capable and not hated, people are much less likely to conspire against him. Conspirators need popular support, or at least popular indifference. If the people love or respect the prince, conspiracies are very risky.
So the best fortress is?
Not to be hated by the people. That's more secure than any physical castle. He looks at the Roman emperors, a really complex situation where they had to balance pleasing the soldiers and the people.
A tough balancing act.
Very tough. Many failed. But he highlights Emperor Severus as someone who managed it brilliantly. Severus was incredibly cruel to the people, but he kept the soldiers loyal through his sheer military prowess and, well, fear. He mastered being both the terrifying lion and the cunning fox, earning admiration even amidst oppression. It shows how a powerful reputation can navigate conflicting demands.
So boiling it down again, these rules, this advice about character, reputation, fear, deception, how do we process this today? It sounds so stark, especially when leaders face pressure from so many different groups.
It is stark, and you're right, leaders today are pulled in many directions. I think Machiavelli's core insight here is about prioritization and flexibility. Meaning, first, figure out which group's dissatisfaction is the most dangerous to your position. Often that's the general populace, because collective hatred is powerful. Appease or control that group first.
Okay.
And second, be flexible. Don't be rigidly good or rigidly cruel. Be prepared to adapt your approach, sometimes the fox, sometimes the lion, based on the specific situation and the specific audience. It's not about being liked by everyone. It's about strategic management of relationships and power to maintain stability and achieve your goals.
Right. Strategic management. Okay, one last major theme. Fortune. Luck. Chance. How does that fit in?
Fortuna. Yes, he tackles this head on. He acknowledges its power. He estimates maybe fortune controls about half of what happens to us.
Only half.
Yes, crucially, he leaves the other half to our free will, our virtue, which means skill, preparedness, decisiveness, agency.
Got it.
He uses this brilliant metaphor of a raging river. When it floods, it destroys everything. Unstoppable.
Right.
But he says that doesn't mean you're helpless. During calm weather, people can build defenses, barriers, dikes, channels to prepare for the flood, to manage its force when it comes.
So you can prepare for bad luck.
Exactly. You can mitigate fortune's impact through foresight and action. He criticizes Italy for being unprepared, like an open plain hit by the river, because it lacked the virtue to build those defenses. Preparation is key.
And does how you act matter in relation to fortune? Cautious versus bold.
Yes, he gets into that too. He thinks success often depends on matching your actions to the spirit of the times. Some situations call for caution, others for boldness.
Like Pope Julius II.
Right. Machiavelli uses him as an example of impetuous, bold action that succeeded because the circumstances were right for it. If Julius had been cautious, he might have failed.
And this leads to another one of his really provocative statements, doesn't it? About fortune being like a woman.
Yes, that one. It's definitely a product of its time and quite jarring today. He says, "Fortune is a woman, and if you wish to keep her under, it is necessary to beat and ill-use her." Yeah. And he continues that she yields more readily to the bold, the adventurous, the young, rather than the cautious. It's a very aggressive metaphor. But the underlying point is that sometimes audacity and taking risks are necessary to seize opportunities or overcome challenges. Passivity doesn't master fortune.
Okay. Moving quickly on. What about advice? Getting counsel from others.
Interesting twist here. He values good counsel, but he flips the usual script. He says, "Good counsels are born of the wisdom of the prince and not the wisdom of the prince from good counsels."
Meaning the prince has to be wise first to even recognize good advice.
Exactly. A prince should ask questions constantly, listen patiently, but he must be the one to make the final decision. He shouldn't rely wholly on advisors, and definitely avoid flatterers. He mentions Emperor Maximilian I as someone who didn't consult properly and ended up being easily swayed or getting nothing done. The prince needs to be discerning and decisive.
So, tying it all together, why did he think the Italian princes of his time failed so badly, lost their states?
He boils it down to their own failings, their sloth, he calls it. They didn't prepare in good times for bad times. They lacked foresight. They relied on mercenaries instead of their own people.
Right.
And when trouble came, they ran away, hoping their subjects would eventually get angry at the conquerors and call them back. A weak hope. True security, he insists, comes only from yourself, from your own virtue, your own valor and preparedness. Self-reliance.
Which brings us right to the end of The Prince, his final chapter.
Yeah.
That exhortation.
Yes, it's a sudden shift in tone, isn't it? Suddenly very passionate, very patriotic.
Yeah. He's calling for a new leader to rise up and liberate Italy, which he describes as enslaved, oppressed, scattered, beaten down.
He sees Italy as ready, waiting for a redeemer. And interestingly, he even outlines a military strategy for this new leader. He argues for a new kind of Italian infantry that could defeat the dominant Swiss and Spanish forces by exploiting their weaknesses.
So he had a practical military plan in mind, too.
It seems so. He believed Italy could be unified and freed, if the right leader emerged. Using the principles he'd laid out, relying on native troops, being both lion and fox, feared but not hated. And he ends the whole book with those powerful lines from the poet Petrarch.
Virtue against fury shall advance the fight.
For the old Roman valor is not dead, nor in the Italians' breasts extinguished. It's a call to arms, really. A hopeful, almost desperate plea.
What a way to end it. So reflecting on this whole journey through The Prince, we've seen this radical pragmatism, the focus on self-reliance, that tricky balance between fear and hatred for reputation, and managing fortune through foresight and sometimes boldness. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. And I think that quote you mentioned earlier is key. In politics, there are no perfectly safe courses. Prudence consists in choosing the least dangerous ones.
Choosing the least dangerous option.
Yeah. It's not about finding perfect solutions. It's about navigating a messy, dangerous world as effectively as possible. And maybe thinking about these raw observations about power, human nature, strategy can be useful beyond just politics.
Oh, so?
Well, think about navigating complex organizations, dealing with competitors, managing teams, even personal challenges sometimes, understanding motivations, the importance of reputation, the need for preparedness, knowing when to be assertive and when to be cautious. These are universal themes, aren't they? It's about seeing the world perhaps a bit more clearly as it is, not just how we wish it were.
That's a great point, seeing the world as it is. So the final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on, what does it mean today in our world to lead with that mix of force and prudence? How do you stay effective, maybe even virtuous in your own way, when faced with that gap? Machiavelli saw the gap between how people live and how they perhaps ought to live.
Tough question.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Machiavelli. We hope it was insightful.
Yeah, I hope you found it useful.
We'll see you next time for another exploration.